in Ireland was thrown into the shade by that of St Patrick, who is universally reverenced as the Apostle of Ireland. This great saint was, like St Paul, free born. His father was Calpurnius, a deacon, who was also a decurio, one of the council, that is, of a municipium, who was son of Potibbius, the son of Odysseus, a presbyter. He was born, he tells us, at Banavem Tiburniae, a place of which nothing is known, except that, since it had decuriones, it must have been within the empire. It was probably on the west coast of Britain, south of the wall of Antoninus. Wherever it was, when he was 16 years of age he was carried off by marauders, with his father's men servants and maid servants, and thousands of others, to Ireland. There, a beardless boy, rough, untaught, he herded the cattle of his master, and prayed. In answer to his prayers he heard a voice in the night telling him that he would return to his native land. He found a ship and was carried over the sea to the home of his parents, who rejoiced that among the pagans he had not fallen from the faith. But he could not rest. He heard his old companions in the Western Isle calling on him to return, and an inward voice warned him that he was to become a bishop. He proposed to go to preach the gospel to those whom he had left behind. Friends naturally dissuaded him from rushing again into peril among a people that knew not God, but he withstood their prayers. He had vowed to God to teach the pagans even to the loss of life itself, if it so pleased him. He returned, and God gave him grace, he says in his simple way, to convert many people and ordain many clergy. In particular, he tells us more than once of the number of his converts who devoted themselves to the ascetic life. Young Scots became monks, and chieftains' daughters innumerable became handmaids of Christ. St Patrick's work succeeded, but not without suffering. He carried his life in his hand, and always looked for death, captivity, or slavery. Chieftains seized him and his companions with a view to kill them. On at least one occasion a body of the newly baptized, still in their white raiment, were butchered or led captive. Christians were sold to heathen Picts. Baptized women and the lands of orphans were distributed to the boon companions of chiefs. How long his work in Ireland lasted is uncertain, as the dates given by the older authorities for his death vary from 457 to 493. Nor is it known where or by whom he was ordained. He himself, in his confession, tells us nothing on this point, though he seems to imply that there was some opposition to his consecration as bishop. The ancient hymn of St Secnal gives the impression that he received his apostleship, like St Paul, direct from heaven. Some ancient authorities describe him as spending some time with Germanus of Auxerre, and as being ordained by him, but nothing of this appears to be known to Constantius, Germanus's almost contemporary biographer. According to some accounts Germanus sent him to Rome to be ordained by Coelestinus himself, while again Coelestinus is described as causing him to be ordained by the priest king Amatho, but Prosper, the pope's secretary, knows nothing of any connection of Coelestinus with Patrick, though he records the mission of Palladius, and the author of the life of Coelestinus in the Liber Pontificalis is equally silent. It has been pointed out that St Patrick laid special stress on the inclination of the Scots of Ireland to the ascetic life, a circumstance which gave so great prominence to the monasteries which sprang up in all parts of the country that the ecclesiastical system established there may be described as monastic rather than diocesan. A monastery rather than an episcopal see was regarded as the centre of the ecclesiastical life and organization for a district. Sometimes the abbot was himself a bishop, sometimes he had among his monks a bishop, who was under his jurisdiction, and performed episcopal offices for the monastery and its dependent district, a state of things probably scarcely to be found elsewhere, though bishop-monks existed in the churches of St Denis and St Martin of Tours in France. The greatest promoter of monasticism in Ireland was Brigida, now known as St Bridget or St Bride, who is said to have been born of noble blood at Faughur, near Dundalk, about the year 453. There is a legend that in her infancy the house in which she was blazed with light and yet nothing was burned, a story which has led some to suppose that traits which originally belonged to the myth of a fire goddess have been transferred to the saint, and it is stated that the Celtic goddess who was the patron of smiths was named Bridget, the fiery arrow. Giraldus Cambrensis tells us that at Kildare St. Bridget had a perpetual fire watched by 20 nuns. All that we know of her early life indicates vigour of character and sweetness of disposition, and an old hymn speaks of her as "a marvellous ladder for pagans to visit the kingdom of Mary's Son." She refused marriage, and at last her father permitted her to dedicate herself to the Lord. The great event of her life was the foundation of the monastery of Kildare, for men and women, which soon had many affiliated establishments in all parts of the country. Bridget, like other heads of convents, had her own bishop, and with him she governed the other houses of her rule, together with their bishops. She is believed to have died at Kildare on the 1st February 523, on which day she is commemorated in the calendar, having earned by her works and her character the title of "the Mary of Ireland." Churches dedicated to St. Bride in all parts of the British Islands testify to the widespread reverence of her name. Christianity found a congenial soil in Ireland. Her warm-hearted and emotional people received with eagerness the story of the self-sacrifice of Christ and of the saints who followed him. After the time of St. Patrick there was little or no persecution. They had a natural bent towards poetry and art, and this was readily turned to Christian subjects. Their songs soon came to celebrate Christian saints instead of pagan heroes. Nowhere perhaps was the whole literature of a country more distinctly influenced by the teaching of the Church, while retaining its own national character. And the remote situation of Ireland favoured her spiritual and intellectual development. While Britain and the Continent were overwhelmed by the Teutonic invasion, she enjoyed calm, and became a light to lighten the mainland of Europe, as well as her nearer neighbours. The earliest of the great Scoto-Irish missionaries was St. Columba. He was born in Ireland, probably in the year 521, of a noble family connected with the Dalriads of Caledonia, and is thought to have begun the foundation of monasteries, of which the chief were Durrow and Derry, about the year 544, when he had received priest's orders. Various reasons, among which it is difficult to distinguish the true one, are given for his leaving Ireland. Whatever the cause, in the year 563, the 42nd of his age, he crossed the strait in a frail bark of wicker covered with hides, and landed with 12 companions on the small isle of High or Iona, afterwards known as Ilcomkill, the Isle of Columba's Cell, separated by a narrow strait from the larger island of Mull. There he founded a monastery, and made it the centre whence he and his followers preached the gospel to the Picts, and revived religion among the Scots, who were already to some extent Christian. High was thenceforth his chief abode, but he was too fully possessed by the eager spirit which urged so many of his countrymen to distant travel to remain quietly in one house. He and his monks undertook many journeys, penetrating, it is thought, as far north as Inverness and as far east as Aberdeen. So far as we know, it was he who first taught Christianity north of the Clyde and the Tay. He also frequently visited Ireland to take the oversight of the monasteries of his foundation. The chronology of this period is somewhat obscure, but it is probable that he died, after a life of constant activity, on June 9, A.D. 597. If this is correct, the Celtic apostle of Caledonia died in the very year in which Augustine set foot on the shore of Kent. A goodly company of disciples carried on Columba's work. The monastery of Iona, like other Celtic foundations of that age, had its bishop, subject to the abbot, and for 2 centuries it was the nursery of bishops, the centre of education, the asylum of religion, the ecclesiastical metropolis of the Celtic race. During those 2 centuries its abbot retained an undisputed supremacy over all the monasteries and churches of Caledonia, and over those of half Ireland. A rule bearing the name of Columba is extant in the old Irish tongue, but this is almost certainly a later production of some Columbite monk or hermit. It is clear that the Scoto-Irish Church was developed in perfect independence of Rome, for it held for many generations customs, such as the predominance of abbots over bishops, a peculiar Easter and a peculiar tonsure, which Rome, when it had the power, put down. In the end, the Celtic churches were absorbed by the Roman. It is curious to reflect that if they had been able to maintain their position, the numerous